Did he give it to you or?
Nothing like that. Don't want it to be in the house. My deliberative shows up much different.
Oh, yeah.
I like carrying my stuff in case there's no stores. Well, now you'll have onions. Forever. Just let one of them do it.
Hello? Can everyone hear me? It's okay. Can you hear me now? It's okay. Can you hear me?
It's not even on.
You can't can you hear me? Or
No, I don't hear the
it's okay.
speaker.
I talk loud normally, so I'll just talk loud.
Is it on?
All right, good. We'll start with just reading from the gospel.
No, no.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. Amen, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or the smallest part of a letter will pass from the law, until all things have taken place. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys and teaches these commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." The Gospel of the Lord. So, of course, this is a great passage to start with. Whoever teaches about the commandments will be called greatest in the kingdom of heaven. So, I'm hoping they get some points teaching tonight. So, but the line that was really important there is just that our Lord does not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. So tonight, talking about two topics. I'm going to try to fit everything I know about them into about an hour, maybe less. We'll see. Canon law, in particular, canon law concerning marriage and annulments. Okay. So the second topic is obviously much more particular, much more practical and kind of specific. But I think it's helpful to have just a broader understanding of what canon law is. Okay, so we'll write that word on the board. Canon. We'll fall over. Okay, canon law. Just so you know where the word comes from, canon. You guys have probably heard canon of scripture. Okay, those are just all the books that are in the Bible belong to the canon. Okay. Early on, let's say maybe in the 4th century. The Romans called their laws lex or leges. So the Romans had their leges, and the church also had their own rules. But they wanted to make clear that these weren't civil laws. So they used a different word, a Greek word, canon. So they called them annulments. Okay? So that just kind of stuck. So whenever we say canon law, we mean not civil law, but church law, the laws that the church follows. These laws have 3 different sources. Okay? There's divine law, natural law, and positive law. It's helpful to have these distinctions so that when you hear about canon law, you know that it's a combination, it's a compilation of all these different sorts of law. Okay? Sometimes the church will change their laws. And some people get really nervous when they hear that because they're like, well, wait, aren't they God's laws? How can you change those? Okay. Well, that's a mistake. They're thinking everything in canon law is divine law. That's just part of it. Okay. On the other hand, sometimes people make the other error and they say, oh, well, the church has this rule now, but they can change it whenever they want. Okay. And that would be true if everything the church had was positive law. Okay. And positive doesn't mean it's law that makes you feel happy and positive. Positive law is law that's been put in place. It's been posited. You could almost call it posited law, but positive is the technical term. Something like a speed limit, okay? It's not like God said, this is a 55-mile-per-hour road, and anyone who doesn't go that speed is acting contrary to nature. Someone decided to make that the law so that order would come about, okay? So when we talk about the laws of the church, it's a compilation of all of these things, okay, all brought together into, nowadays, just one big book. Has anyone seen this before, the Code of Canon Law? Yeah, good. Father Pinto's seen it. That's a good thing. I remember I was probably in middle school when I first saw a copy of this, and I thought, it's got one book with all the rules in it. I was so excited. It's not that exciting of a book, but it was still kind of impressive to realize we have such a thing as a book of laws. Okay? But just to give examples of how the church gathers these laws from different sources, an example of divine law would be something like the sacraments. Okay, the essential form of the sacraments. Baptism. Hopefully you guys know how to baptize in case of emergency. You need to wash with water and say, I baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Okay? You cannot change those things. I can't change them. Father Pinto can't change them. The bishop can't change them. The Pope can't change them. Okay? Because Jesus himself gave us the form of that sacrament. We have to use water. We have to invoke the Trinity. Okay? And all of the sacraments have some component like that comes from Jesus himself. Okay? If he wanted to change it, he could come down from heaven and tell us to do it differently. Okay? But no less authority can change those things. Okay? So, divine law. Natural law would be a lot of things related to morality. Okay? The 10 Commandments are kind of just a summary of natural law. So like, think something like, you shall not commit adultery, okay? Ever since God created people, okay, it was always forbidden that you could not commit adultery. Okay, when God gave the 10 Commandments, he was expressing in words the contents of the moral law, but that law still existed. Of course, we have to worship God and him alone. Of course, we have to honor our parents. Of course, we shall not kill. We shall not commit adultery. We shall not steal. Those things just belong to nature. Okay? So again, a bishop can't just wake up one day and say, you know what, that whole adultery thing, I'll give you a dispensation. Just this once. He can't do that. Okay? It belongs to the natural law. And so sometimes the code reiterates that. Okay? There's a section here on penalties. Okay? So like murdering someone. There are penalties for that in the church, okay? Maybe just for clerics. So I think we would get in trouble by the church. The rest of you would be subject to civil authority on that, okay? But again, the church isn't saying, you know what, we're going to make a law because we just don't want people to do that. It's reiterating what's in the natural law, just expressing it, okay? And then, sorry, I'm just reading the book. Okay. Positive law. These would be like norms or almost like guidelines, things the church has laid down. So, and these are the sorts of things that can change. Okay, so right now in the church, if you want to be ordained a priest, you must be at least 25 years old. Okay, I think it's good that there's some minimum age. If someone was 21 years old, could they still be ordained?
Maybe.
If he got special permission, he could. Okay, it's not like Jesus said somewhere, oh, they got to be 25 at least. Okay, Jesus didn't say that. The apostles didn't say anything. So there's kind of this tradition that they should have a certain amount of maturity. It's a very good idea for priests to have a certain degree of maturity. Okay, so there's a minimum age, but it could change. Maybe the bishop notices after a while, all these 25-year-old priests, they're kind of immature. So we're going to raise the age even higher. Okay? And so that's something that the authorities of the church can change as kind of like a speed limit, okay? We notice everyone's, let's say this was 70 miles per hour out here, okay? And everyone's crashing into everyone else. We're going to lower it to 55 or whatever it is, And that's something that authorities can change and decide on as needed, okay? So canon law gathers all of these together as needed so that the church can be governed, okay? Again, the divine and natural law are the basis. Okay? What has Christ revealed about our religion in particular? Okay? And what has God revealed about who we are as human beings? What's right and wrong for us? What are we made for? And then everything else Is the church trying to connect the rest of the dots? Okay. Some of the norms of the church are very, very old. Okay, so they could be changed, but they probably aren't going to be changed. Take something like ordination of a bishop. In the earliest records we have, it was always the case you needed 3 bishops to consecrate a priest to make him into a bishop. Since the earliest records we have show that this is how it was done, we're not going to change that. It's possible it's just a positive law, and it could be changed, but because it's been the rule for so long, we want to be really careful about making any kind of changes to anything that's been the practice of the church for that long. Okay? Quiz time. Does anyone know when this book was published? This Code of Canon Law? 3 guesses, whoever wants to venture. I'll say lower or higher, so the third person has the best chance.
1983.
Ah, you got it. Yeah, 1983 is when the Code of Canon Law was published. So does that mean we just didn't have any laws before 1983? Oh no, it's a long history. So I won't give the entire history. How much time? Yeah, I'll just give just a real quick crash course in the history of the church, of the history of canon law in the church. Okay. First of all, we have the Gospels. Okay. Jesus Christ talks about things like the government of the church. What did he say to Peter? You are Peter. On this rock I build my church. I give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. What you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Okay? Matthew 16. Okay? That's telling us about the authority that Peter and his successors have. Okay? We have him speaking about marriage, saying divorce is not permitted. Okay? Or if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery. Again, that's in the Gospels, and it remains a principle for how the church governs now. Acts of the Apostles. You go to Acts chapter 15. They have questions. What do we do about these Jewish converts who are coming into the church? Okay, they've got all these practices that they're used to. Now we have Gentile converts, non-Jewish converts, and they're not used to observing all these practices. They like eating meat with blood still in it, whereas Jews find that offensive. Okay, so what do? The apostles have a council, and they lay down laws. Okay, some of those laws are still observed today. Some of them are not. It's okay to have blood sausage, even though the Acts of the Apostles show the apostles forbidding it. Okay, so it was a positive law laid down even at that time to help govern the church that was useful then, maybe isn't useful at all times. We have the letters of the New Testament. In particular, the letters of St. Paul. I always tell people if they want the first introduction to canon law, read the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. He gives rules on who should receive Holy Communion, who should not receive Holy Communion, rules about marriage, rules about celibacy, rules about fasting. All of this stuff, those are the kinds of things canon law is about. And we see St. Paul making rulings there. There's a controversy about whether women should wear veils in church or not. Okay? And what does he say? He says, look, all the other churches are doing it, so if you're going to ask me, just do it. Okay? Was he saying there that's divine law? No. He was making a judgment. So it's the kind of thing the church could enforce. Okay? But it's the kind of thing the church can dispense as well. Okay? So we see kind of canon law at work, even in the New Testament. Okay? We'll go a little bit further. We'll go to the year 325. Anyone know what happened in the year 325? Council of Nicaea. A lot of times when people hear about the early councils of the church, Council of Nicaea, Council of Constantinople, Council of Ephesus, Council of, I can go through them all. Most people are thinking about the doctrinal controversies. Okay, does anyone know what the Council of Nicaea was about doctrinally?
Arians.
Yeah, is Jesus God? That's our big question at the Council of Nicaea. That's usually what people think about when they think about it. But then if you opened up the book of the Acts of the Council of Nicaea, you would notice, okay, here's the Nicene Creed that took care of that part. But then you get all these canons about who can become a bishop. If you become a bishop, what gets included in your territory? What are you allowed to tell priests to do? What are you supposed to wear? What are you supposed to do to fast to get ready for Easter? And you're like, what does this have to do with whether Jesus is God or not? It doesn't have a whole lot to do with any of that. But they're the questions that were relevant to the church in that day. And so they had to make rulings. They made canons. Okay? They did canons. So 325 is the first ecumenical council. The first council where they got many bishops together so that its rulings could apply to the whole church. Okay, so it's an important date. I'm not going to remember all of them. 381 was another important one. 451 was an important one. 431 was also an important one. And over time, these would just be gathered in collections. So if you wanted to know what does the church teach as far as our practice, you just have to collect all these different acts of Council of Nicaea, acts of the Council of Constantinople, the canons of the Council of Ephesus, and there's all these collections. Who else do you get involved here? You get these guys, okay? Especially around the year 800, popes started to become much more bold in their enactments, okay? You had popes attending the councils and approving the councils, but popes around 800 were starting to say, you know what? I'm the successor of St. Peter. I don't have to have a council to make a rule that applies to the whole church. So then they would just make rules that apply to the whole church. So now, if you want to know your canon law, you need a collection of certainly the scriptures, okay? You need all the canons of the councils from 325 onward. There might have been a couple before that too. You need all the letters written by all the popes ever. And this starts to get kind of complicated. So in the year 1050, okay, you had a guy named Graziano. And he was just a scholar of canon law. And he wrote a huge work called the Decretum. Decretum. And what it is it's really a textbook, okay? You had priests like Father Pinto and me 1,000 years ago struggling to learn all these rules. And so he says, well, let me organize all these rules. Take them from the different councils, take them from Pope's letters, and put them all in order so you can study them. So even though this was only a textbook, even the popes thought, hey, this book is really useful. We're going to start using it. So it almost has the status of a law book itself because it organized the laws so well. Of course, popes love making laws back then, so they keep making laws, and then there's more laws, okay? Until you get to the year 1234, okay? In the year 1234, you had Pope Gregory. This isn't all in the test, by the way. I think it's helpful to note this didn't come out of nowhere. Gregory the Ninth, Greg 9, okay? He thought, we need another collection of all the Pope's writings again, okay, as a good legal text. So they hired Saint Raymond of Peñafort, okay? He's the patron saint of canon lawyers. And basically, he took Saint Raymond, locked him in a room with all of the letters any pope had ever written. And I think about 2 years later, he came out and said, I got it. I have the book, okay? It was organized into 5 very neat sections. I can't tell you what the sections are off the top of my head because we don't still use those same sections. But that collection from 1234 became the basis of the church's laws until the year 1917, okay? If popes made new laws after this date, they had to fit them into one of the 5 sections of Raymond's book. Otherwise, nobody would read it because nobody would be able to find it, okay? So he followed the same structure of that book that Raymond put together that Gregory promulgated. 1917. Does anyone know what book came out that year? This was the first edition of the Code of Canon Law. Even though Raymond did such a great job organizing the laws of the church, and the popes did a pretty good job making sure their new laws still fit in all the different sections, it still got out of control after a while, okay? And it was at this time, it'd been a century already, but the Napoleonic Code had come out, okay? So France had codified all of their laws. In Germany, you had a kind of enlightenment going on where they were codifying all of their laws. So the Pope thought, hey, we're modern, we're cool, we're hip. Let's codify our laws just like the rest of Europe. Okay? And so you had a guy named Gaspari, was his name. They threw him in a room with all of these laws, and they said, codify it for us. They had one guy do it, and he did it. He produced the first version of the Code of Canon Law. And that became the governing document of the church. What's interesting is if you check the footnotes in it, you can always find where it refers back to the laws that were made from 1234. Sometimes it'll cite this book from 1050, and if you go back to this book, you can find where it's citing letters of popes from before that, or even councils going back to the beginning of the church. Why is this important? Because it tells us the church isn't just making up laws, but is trying to preserve a sort of tradition. Sometimes we have to change things, tweak things to make sure that especially the divine law is being observed and kept. But we try to keep a sort of continuity, so it really does look the same. 1962. Does anyone remember anything significant that year? Yeah, Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. Okay, that's right, V2. Okay. If the Council of Nicaea was the first ecumenical council, the Second Council of Nicaea was the 21st. That's right. So yeah, 21st ecumenical council. It said a lot of things. A lot of people did not read the documents and just sort of thought, we're a new church now. Okay. If you actually read the documents on the church, on the liturgy, on the modern world, you see, actually, they're just teaching what's been taught for the ages and presenting it anew for the church of today. Okay. One of the reasons for the chaos is that the council did not produce canons. They said someone will do that later. And thankfully, someone did do it later. Brings us to 1983. Who was your pope at that time?
John Paul.
Yeah, Pope John Paul II. Okay? And he's the one that put out this book, updating the one from 1917, making sure it reflects everything that was taught at the Second Vatican Council so that it could apply to Catholics in the world today now. And so if you go through this book and look at the footnotes, you'll find in almost every footnote, there's either some reference to the Second Vatican Council or some reference to the 1917 Code, which you can then check to find its reference to all the history of the church. Okay? So again, that's just a really quick crash course in the entire history of canon law. Okay? Pope Benedict changed a few laws, Pope Francis changed a few laws, but these are kind of the main highlights. Okay? Any questions so far? Okay, good. One more, just one more sub point on canon law itself before we move into marriage and annulments. Okay? I think one of the easiest ways to get to know what a book is about is just to look at the table of contents. Okay? And so, I don't know if you've ever picked up a code of canon law, but I'll just real quick tell you the 7 books. It's composed of 7 different books. And again, that just gives you a sense of what canon law touches on. Okay? The first one is general norms. This is the kind of stuff you would have in any legal system. So for example, the Constitution we have in America, right? We have our three branch system. Sorry, I'm an American government. I just know canon law. We have our 3 branches. You have checks and balances. You have different ways to introduce laws, different people enforcing laws, different people judging laws. That's all part of it. So general norms is kind of establishing that. Okay, what is a law in the church? How do you make a law? I'm just a bill. It's in there. Okay, we don't have bills like that. We have the Pope. Okay, but yeah, what is a law? What is a decree? What is a dispensation? How do you calculate time? Okay, what is a person? Okay, what are the characteristics a person can have? Okay, that's all stuff in general norms. Okay, just very general stuff that any legal system would have, and we have our certain way of doing it. Number 2 is on the people of God. Okay, this really does reflect the Second Vatican Council in particular, because it understands that everyone in the church has a certain role. I think the earlier code really just talked about clergy, priests, bishops, and stuff like this. Here it gets into all of that. Talks about the hierarchy. Talks about religious life. And it talks about the laity. Everything from their rights and duties, who's in charge of what, who has authority over what, who can appoint who to what. There's a section on parishes, who's in charge of the parish. It's the pastor, okay? What are his rights as pastor? What are his responsibilities as pastor? What can he do? What can't he do? Okay, that's all under the hierarchical order of the church. Religious life, okay? Of course, any of us can choose to be holier than we were yesterday. You can choose to fast. You can choose to make vows, okay? But the church governs religious life because it's essentially vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Obedience to what? To whom? To God and to his church. Okay, so religious life is governed by the code. And then laity, okay? You guys actually don't have as many responsibilities as we do, but you still do have responsibilities. And the responsibilities you have that we don't do pertain to things like civic life, okay? Things related to families, the care of children, all these sorts of things that you are responsible for, that we as priests should be making sure you find out about and are acting, okay? So people look out. Book 3 is on the teaching office of the church, okay? Notice when you go to Mass, it's not just anybody giving the homily, but it's someone who, no, it's not just anyone giving the homily. It's someone who's been given that authority by the church to teach, okay? Someone this evening was telling me they're writing a book, okay? And it's about religious material. So they're talking about submitting it for approval by the church, because the church has the right and responsibility to teach the gospel. And so we also have that responsibility to govern the teaching of the gospel, okay? Book 4. This is probably the most exciting book. It's on sacraments. Or the sanctifying function of the church, okay? Each one of the 7 sacraments has its own section in the code. I think I found this most interesting when I was a kid, discovering the code. Okay, there's rules for who can baptize, what you have to do when you're baptizing, different exceptions. If someone's about to die, you can baptize then. Otherwise, what's the norm? Confirmation, who can be confirmed, who can confirm, what you need to confirm. Holy Eucharist, who's worthy to receive Holy Eucharist? Who should you be careful not to give Holy Eucharist to? How do you reserve the Blessed Sacrament appropriately? All of those things are contained here. Okay? Confessions. The fact that, a screen has to be available to you for confession. Okay? That's in canon law. You have a right to anonymity when you go to confession. Okay? The priest needs to provide for that. Anointing of the sick. Okay? Again, there aren't a whole lot of rules because when you're about to die, the church is really ready to make sacraments easy to receive. Okay, so there aren't a whole lot of rules there, except that there has to be at least a danger of death. Holy orders, there are lots of rules there. We do not just want anyone becoming a deacon or a priest or a bishop, okay? So we have many rules on who can be admitted to that. And finally, marriage. We're going to get into a lot of those rules shortly, okay? There's also stuff on cemeteries, chapels, churches, holy places, and sacred times, like holy days of obligation. Number 5 is temporal goods. Okay, stuff. Okay, people ever heard the phrase, was it possession is 9/10 of the law? Okay, well, in church law, it's just about 1/7 of the law, so it's much less. Okay, but it still does have a place. Okay, bishops cannot just say, "Oh, it's church stuff. I can do whatever I want with it." Okay, the church has finance councils. We have norms for how funds are used. Not just anyone can come into any church and raise money. There's rules about that. The bishop's annual appeal, I'm sure, follows a lot of these different norms that exist. Okay, so that's not just going to the bishop's yacht, or he doesn't have a yacht, as far as I know. Just so you know. Okay, but there are rules for how all these things are governed because they're not just our stuff. Okay, they're ecclesiastical goods. They belong to the church. Okay, we know the church has a right to possess property because it goes all the way back to the gospel. Okay, Judas, who didn't do a great job, nonetheless was in charge of holding the money back. Okay, so even though the apostles renounced their personal property, they did hold some property in common. Okay, and so there were rules for governing that. okay, which could be broken, but shouldn't be, okay? But if they are, book 6 is called Sanctions, okay? It could be titled also Crime and Punishment, okay? Pope Francis most recently actually redid the whole of book 6 to make it a little more clear. Okay, I think after Vatican II, people were pretty optimistic about human nature and thought, surely priests don't do anything wrong ever, do they? Well, experience has shown that priests are indeed capable of doing things wrong, as other people are. And so Pope Francis has tightened things a bit more here, okay? What are the sorts of things people can be punished for in the church? What can happen? Things like being excommunicated, okay? This tells you what you can be excommunicated for. Things like being suspended. Maybe a priest is told you can't exercise ministry for a time. Being laicized. It's a very kind of heavy penalty, but that could be something that happens because of certain actions, okay? And then finally, which we're also going to touch on this was the most boring section of the code when I was a child. I could not understand any of it. The last book is on processes, okay? Procedural law, okay? I have since written my master's thesis on this part of the code, so it's very dear to my heart now, okay? And I get to do it every day. It's fun. Not every day, once a week, okay? I don't do canon law work every day, okay? But when I do, this is what I'm doing. So I'm going to go into just a bit of that so you understand at least one process in outline, which is the annulment process, okay? So that's the code in outline. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Just going back to the first part, you said there's 3 different types of laws. So can you look at every canon law and say, oh, that's a divine law, that's a positive law? Or are there some that are amalgams of a couple or 3?
No, I think you could actually. Procedural law is actually kind of the weirdest one, where it'd be hard to sort that out, but because, again, I study procedural law a lot to see where it comes from. The way it's done in the church has its roots in Roman law to a great extent, but also ancient Jewish legal practice, and also just kind of best practices kind of stuff. So it's a huge collection in that way. If you went to, like, let's say you go to the sacrament section, so sacraments, for example, I'll talk about impediments shortly, but like someone who hasn't reached puberty, for example, can such a person get married? No. Okay? By natural law, it's not possible because they're not able to do the things that marriage requires of its nature. Okay? Now the church sets a hard limit, 16, okay, is the youngest a man can get married in the church. Okay? In America, if you're trying to get married under 18, we probably wouldn't allow it either. Okay, but since the church has to govern the entire world, they set it at 60. Okay, that's a positive law. The church saying we have to pick some number, so we're going to pick one. Okay, but like the natural law limit might be somewhere else. Okay, whereas the positive law is kind of picking something determined. Okay, so do you see how that kind of is kind of in the middle between natural and positive law? So all law, it's a compilation, but yeah, it will have its source in multiple of those. And marriage is kind of weird. It's part of human nature, okay? Man and woman can come together. It's necessary for children. It's necessary for common life, all those things. But what did our Lord do with marriage? He took it and elevated it to the dignity of a sacrament, okay? So you have not just natural law, you have divine law, okay? Do different cultures have different features in marriage? Yes. So there might also be positive laws that surround marriage as well. Okay? And so like marriage law will take into account all of those different factors. Okay. But yeah, I think you could tease out a lot of those things. Sometimes it's really obvious. If you ever see scripture quoted in the footnotes, that's a really good sign it's divine law. Okay? Sometimes it will say by nature, such and such. Okay? So it's saying you just need to know this. Okay? When it talks about the authority of the Pope, it says, by divine law, our Lord Jesus Christ established that the successor of St. Peter has universal immediate jurisdiction over the entire church. So it's like, okay, that's divine law. It says very explicitly that is the case. Okay? The church cannot just decide to switch to an elected democracy or something. Okay? There's some changes over the history of how the Pope was elected, but that the Pope has a certain authority comes from divine law. Okay, so does that answer your question?
Yep.
Yeah, so good question. Any other questions? So far, so good? Okay, good. So now we'll get to marriage. I'll just read the first canon in the section on marriage. You don't have to memorize these. Canon 1095, it's 1055, sorry, starts the section on marriage. And it starts with the definition. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life, and which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring, has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized. So there's a lot in there. But that's your starting point. Okay, so I guess I'll just tell you the two sections in this kind of presentation on annulments. Annulment itself is a process, okay? So there's procedural part, but in order to have a process about marriage, you have to know what it is. So we call that the substantive law. What is the substance that the church is making a judgment about, okay? So in order for, I'm a judge for the church, by the way. I don't know if I didn't say that, but yes, I'm a judge. So for me to be able to judge, I have to know what is marriage, okay? And therefore, what are the ways something can fall short of being a marriage, okay? When we say annulment, that's kind of shorthand for making a decree of nullity, okay? What's happening is the church is looking at a marriage, taking evidence, taking information about it, and making a judgment about, is this indeed a marriage? Or is this marriage lacking something necessary for it to be a marriage and is therefore null? Okay. So I have to know what a marriage is and how something can be defective. And then the procedural law, what are the steps I take to make that determination? Okay, so I'm a judge. You can't just come up to me and say, Father, what about this marriage? I can't just say, yeah, it looks null. Go ahead, you're free to marry now. Okay, no, we have to follow a process. Okay, you probably heard due process, right? It's a civil term, but that applies for us as well. We need a process for the outcome to be a just outcome, to be, yeah. So we'll look just once more at this definition of marriage. The matrimonial covenant by which a man and a woman establish between themselves a partnership of the whole of life. We've got a few things already in there. Has to be a man and a woman, okay? I don't care what Congress says, okay? I don't care what a pop singer says, okay? If it's not between a man and a woman, it has nothing to do with marriage, as far as I'm concerned. I have no interest in it, okay? Must be between a man and a woman, and it's a partnership of the whole of life, okay? You can have different, you're a woman, I'm a man. We have a business partnership, okay? That doesn't make us married, okay? It's a partnership of the whole of life, which is ordered by its nature to the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. Okay. Sometimes people get caught up here, well, Father, what if I'm so old I can't have children? Okay, well, that's possible. That can happen. There might be other reasons it can't happen. Okay. But it's by its nature ordered to that. The relationship of husband and wife is the kind of relationship from which children can come and do naturally, okay? This is particularly interesting to us because it has been raised by Christ the Lord to the dignity of a sacrament between the baptized, okay? Marriage is a natural reality that can exist between a man and a woman, okay? Any two human beings, man and woman, other things being equal, can get married, okay? If both of those persons are baptized, that marriage is, by that very fact, a sacrament, okay? Sometimes people wonder what makes a marriage sacramental. That's what does it. Baptism, okay? You're a human being, okay? If we baptize you, you're now a Christian human being, okay? Got two people and they're married, baptize both those peoples, now you have a Christian marriage, okay? So that's what does it, okay? You can get into, well, what happens if you have a Christian marrying a non-Christian, Catholic marrying a non-Catholic? They can get complicated. But it's baptism that makes it a sacrament. For this reason, a valid matrimonial contract cannot exist between the baptized without it being, by that fact, a sacrament. Just read the next couple canons again, just so you know what the church is looking for when they're looking for marriage. The essential properties of marriage are unity and indissolubility, which in Christian marriage attain a special firmness by reason of the sacrament. Okay? Unity, meaning it's just with one other person. Indissolubility, that means it cannot, by its nature, be dissolved, except by death. Okay, I always tell people that's the easiest way to get out of marriage. Okay? So, how do you get married? The consent of the parties legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law makes marriage. No human power is able to supply this consent. I erased my timeline, but around the year 1120 or whatever, there was a little bit of a controversy about what makes a marriage. Is it consent or is it consummation? Okay, we have a younger audience, so I won't get explicit on what consummation is, but that's what makes marriage able to produce children, okay? Which one of those makes marriage? The answer that won out and that the church has held to ever since is consent. That is the essential feature that makes marriage. Consummation is very important, okay? And if you have questions about that, we can talk about that more afterwards. But consent is what makes the marriage. What is consent? Matrimonial consent is an act of the will by which a man and a woman mutually give and accept each other through an irrevocable covenant in order to establish marriage. So consent is so essential that no one can do that part for you. Okay? If he's like, oh, I want to marry you, okay, and he even abducts you, takes you away to marry you, make you his wife, until you say yes, you are not his wife. You both have to agree to it. Okay? This is something of the equality of man and woman that the church has always understood and taught. Okay? It has to be a mutual act of consent. Okay? I think they did do that. You guys are, yeah. Okay. So yeah, they like each other. What else? Okay. So what's great about this canon is it provides us with everything we need to try to figure out, well, when is a marriage null? Okay? Where if someone's doubting, I don't know if I was really married. I don't know if my marriage really took. This canon tells us what to be looking for. The consent of the parties. I'll figure out where I'm going to, yeah. It says, legitimately manifested between persons qualified by law. That's right, qualified persons. If you're missing any one of these three, or if there's a serious defect in any one of these three, the marriage can be declared null. Okay. Does anyone here know anyone who's been through this process, by the way? Someone who's gotten an annulment, or someone who's been through, yeah. Sometimes people wonder, well, my friend got his annulment, it took him like 3 weeks. It was real fast. Whereas somebody else will say, oh, well, my friend tried to do it, and it took like 2 whole years. It shouldn't take that long normally in any case, but it could. Okay, I've seen cases that get extended over a year for different reasons. It's because some of these are much easier to prove than others. Okay, we'll start with legitimately manifested. Okay, this has to do with canonical form. If you've ever heard of someone getting married in the church, okay, that doesn't mean just being in the church building. It means getting married the way the church says you're supposed to get married. Okay? What do you need for that? You need 5 people. Okay? Sorry, you're the closest couple, so I'm going to use you guys my example.
Yeah.
You need a woman who wants to get married, a man who wants to get married, 2 witnesses. Anyone will do. Take you, that's fine. Okay? Usually it's the best man, maid of honor. Okay? 2 witnesses. That's why people say, oh, I want this many bridesmaids, this many, groomsmen. Just make sure you've got 2, at least 2. I need 2. Okay? And then they have to exchange their consent before a duly delegated minister of the church. Okay? In this parish, there are 2 people who always have authority to witness marriages. Your pastor is one of them. The bishop is the other one. Okay? If I wanted to witness a marriage here, I would need his delegation or the bishop's delegation. Okay? If a deacon wants to witness marriage, he needs the pastor's delegation or the bishop's delegation. Okay? And that's what canonical form refers to. Getting married in the church. Okay? Let's say, I'll pick on someone else. Okay, let's say you're Catholic, okay? And you want to marry a Catholic. I guess you guys are married, right? Okay. So you want to marry a Catholic, okay? And you go to the courthouse down the street, and you manifest consent between each other. You've got witnesses. Are they married?
Not the church.
No. Yeah, maybe civilly. Okay, civil law will recognize it. The church will not. Okay. So if he later on, a month later, is like, you know what? I want to marry this other girl in the church. What's the church going to say? That's fine. You're free to marry. You never married. What's her name? Okay. We might say, well, wait, what about this other girl? And we have a few questions. Okay. But as far as establishing whether there was something defective, it's very easy to prove. Okay. We look at their marriage certificate, say, oh, this says it was at the courthouse. Okay. But you have a baptismal certificate. This says you're Catholic. Okay. Which means you're required to marry in this way. Okay. So it's real easy to prove if you did it or you didn't do it. Okay? Let's say, again, I'm just picking on people. I don't know any of the facts about anyone's marriage here. Okay? Let's say they got married in the courthouse, both Catholic, but they got married in the courthouse. And a month later, maybe one of the in-laws is just bugging them. You really got to get your marriage blessed or anything. They can do that. Okay? They approach Father, say, Father, sorry, we were hasty. We just really like each other. Can we get married in the church? And Father being real generous, being very helpful, he might walk them through some marriage prep, make sure they know maybe a little more than they already do. But then, he would have them renew their consent before a minister, before 2 witnesses, to make sure that canonical form is observed. Okay? And then they cannot do the easy annulment process. Okay? Because they've observed that part. Okay? So in some ways, this is the easiest requirement. Okay? But it's the easiest thing to prove is missing, okay? Whenever people leave the church for many years, get married outside the church, they're coming back, they've been through a divorce or 3, it happens. I'm always a little excited when I found out they got married outside the church, because I could say, oh, that's easy, okay? Again, it'd be better if they just did everything they're supposed to, okay? But these are really easy cases just because it's basically paperwork, okay? We just see, oh, yep, you're Catholic. Yep, you didn't get married in the church. Okay, declared no. Very easy.
Question.
Yeah.
Right. What if they get married in a Protestant church?
Yeah, good question. Again, if at least, so who's bound? This is important too. Who's bound by canonical form?
Catholics.
Only Catholics. Okay. If you have 2 people getting married and one of them is Catholic, canonical form is required. Okay. It just is. It didn't always used to be that way, but you had a real big problem with clandestine marriages in the 16th century, so that's when they made it a universal law. The Pope could change it someday if he wanted to, but for now, this is the way we do it. So remember I said, who are the 2 people who have the authority to witness marriage here? It's the pastor of this parish, it's the bishop of this diocese, okay? And only someone who's delegated by them, okay? So does that include the Methodist pastor in town? It doesn't. Does that include the Anglican priest in town? it doesn't, okay? So as long as one party's Catholic, they're bound by canonical form. Okay? Let's say you got a Catholic boy, falls in love with a nice Lutheran girl, and the Lutheran girl's parents would just disown her completely if they didn't get married in the Lutheran church, okay? The bishop could dispense from canonical form, okay? I'm trying to think if I've seen cases like that, but it is possible, okay? So this is a requirement, but again, because it's positive law, it can be dispensed. And that would be one case where like they could go before a judge or another sort of minister, but there's a reason why the church, this is the default, okay? If you are Catholic, this is what we expect of you, okay? Under pain of nullity, that is, or else the marriage is not valid, okay? So, okay, easiest to determine. Second easiest, are they qualified persons, okay? There's a, oh, here, I have my hand. The next canon. All persons who are not prohibited by law can contract marriage. Okay? Anyone can get married, unless you're not allowed to. Okay? So that's what the church says. You're not allowed to if you have what's called an impediment. There are different sources of impediments. Some are by nature, and some are by positive law. Okay, so let's say I wasn't a priest and I wanted to marry this person right here. Why can't I do that? It's my sister. Okay, yes, we have the same parents. Okay. Did the Pope decide that that's not okay? Nature decides that that's not okay. Okay, so that norm is repeated in the Code of Canon Law, just to be clear. Okay, the church actually has all these rules about consanguinity. Okay, so like, can you marry your cousin? Can you marry your second cousin? Can you marry your aunt? Can you marry your uncle? It's got rules for all of that stuff. Okay, the rule, as far as I understand, is always fun. Basically, your first cousin is where it's forbidden. You could get a dispensation to marry your first cousin. In Michigan, you will not receive that dispensation because it is civilly illegal in Michigan, okay? Well, let's say you live in Spain, you didn't grow up with your first cousin, she's pretty, I don't know. If you ask the bishop really nicely, he could give a dispensation, okay? We don't talk about that case very much because it doesn't come up for us, okay? In the Middle Ages, it was so common to marry closely and that they really noticed things were not good when that was happening. So they actually forbade marrying your fifth cousin, okay? So you actually had to check, like, okay, I've never met this person before, they live 3 towns over, but they really had to check, are we related? Okay, because there were just fewer people back then, okay? And so the church got pretty strict about it for a while because people were marrying just a little too close for comfort, okay? So yeah, so natural relationship is an impediment by nature, okay? Again, the church can dispense some of those, like first cousins, okay? It cannot dispense like siblings, cannot dispense with mother or children, okay? It's always been forbidden. Everywhere, always. That's it, okay. Yeah. Now, I am a priest, in fact, okay? Let's say I meet, a lovely lady, we fall in love, it's great, and, Father Pinto forgets that I'm a priest, so he agrees to marry us. Does that take? No. As a cleric, I am prohibited by law from marrying, okay? So the impediment would make it null. So let's say she gets tired of living with me after a month, okay? I tried, okay? She applies for an annulment. She says, oh, and by the way, he was a priest. The judge is like, oh, good. That's easy, okay? Easy annulment, okay? So some of those cases are very easy to prove when you have an impediment. What's a complicated case? I mentioned consanguinity. Adoption, okay? Can you marry someone you adopted? You're not related by blood, but yeah, it's weird, okay? So that would be a little more complicated. We'd have to ask a few more questions, but it would probably still be an easy case, okay? I'm trying to think if I wrote any other impediment. Yeah, age, again, 18, I think is the law in Michigan. You can't get married below 18. I'm pretty sure that's the law. So the church, yeah. So the church wouldn't allow you to, okay? But if you did get married under 18, it would only be an impediment in the church if you were under 16, okay? So then it would be automatic. But if it's over that age, there's a little more complicated. I'm trying to think I didn't write all the... Oh, a bond of prior marriage, okay? So let's say, you meet a nice young lady, you want to get married to her, and you go ahead and try and do it. What's the problem there? He's already married, okay? So that's an impediment. If you are married, you cannot get married, okay? That's called the impediment of prior bond. That's when that comes up every so often. So, see, abducted woman, yeah, you can't abduct a woman and marry her unless you get dispensation. These don't come up that often. It's a big church. Okay, so, good. These are rare, but usually simple. Hard. Okay. Consent is an act of the will. Can you see an act of consent? No. Usually it's manifested verbally. Okay, one person says, I do. The other person says, I do. We hope they mean it. Okay? And in general, we presume they mean it. The church presumes that people mean what they say. Okay? Is it possible they don't mean it? Yes. Okay? So there are two ways consent can be defective. Okay? There's involuntary defects. There might be like a much more concise way to do this, but I only know how to teach in the mode of a canon law teacher. This is how we teach the deacons, so you guys are just getting it all from the fire hose. So, voluntary defects. Okay? A voluntary defect would be very, it's something that you choose to do. Okay? Maybe you're saying I do to this guy, but you're like, I don't really mean it. I'm still going to go back to my other boyfriends, maybe even during the wedding reception, okay? So she's saying, oh yeah, I'll be with you forever. She does not mean it, okay? So there's a voluntary defect of consent, okay? That can pertain to some part of marriage, openness to children. You could say you are. The church makes you say you're open to children, but you're not really. You could say the church requires you to be faithful. And so you could say it, but not mean it. And indissoluble. I don't know, trial marriages, there was a decade or two where that became a thing. Oh, we'll get married for 5 years, and if we get bored, we'll just get divorced. Okay? Well, the church says if you're going into a marriage with that understanding, that's not marriage. Okay? So that would be a voluntary defect. Okay? Any questions? Sure. Yeah, so that could be there are rules in the code for placing conditions on marriage, okay? And as long as the condition is met, it is a valid marriage. Now, a prenuptial agreement might be a sign that you don't intend permanence in the marriage, and so I would be careful. The church actually usually only allows it with the bishop's permission, but it could technically be allowed. Most pastors would just say, don't do it, okay? It's a bad sign, as it were, okay? But let's say Kim wanted to marry a doctor her entire life. Steve says, I'm a doctor, okay? And so Kim says, well, I'm marrying you, but only if you're really a doctor. As long as he's really a doctor, they are indeed married, okay? But if he's like, oh, I'm not really a doctor, then the marriage is invalid because she based it on a condition in the present, okay? Again, I've never actually seen this sort of case come up. It's extremely rare, but I have studied the possibility, okay? So yeah, so that would be, so a prenuptial agreement often involves a condition, but sometimes a condition about the future. Okay, well, the future hasn't happened yet, so you can't make your marriage contingent on that. So you would have to look at the prenuptial agreement to see if it's the sort of thing that just invalidates the marriage, or whether it's the kind of condition that can be allowed because it's fulfilled in the present, okay? So it's complicated, but in general, I would say avoid it. So, yeah. So those are voluntary defects. You say one thing, you explicitly intend something else, okay? Involuntary defects. This can happen, there are a number of different ways it can be involuntary. One is through, I'm going to write down, I'll just read the canon. 1095 is a canon that every canonist has memorized. We just call these 1095 cases, okay? Do I have it on here? Okay. All right. I'll just read it out loud. The following are incapable. Yeah. So someone who has an incapacity, okay? In order to make an act of consent, you have to have a working intellect, a working will, and a working critical faculty, okay? This is why children, among other reasons, can't get married, okay? They might be mature enough to make, to do good, to do bad, okay? They're not yet mature enough to make a decision for the whole of life, okay? They're not capable of giving themselves entirely to someone else. Certain mental defects. So someone's like an adult, but they still like a child, okay? That would be an incapacity, okay? So I'll just read what the canon says. The following are incapable of contracting marriage. Those who lack the sufficient use of reason, okay? So someone who's just not capable of using the reasoning faculty, okay? This first one refers to kind of a more serious thing, someone who's basically like a child, even if they are over 18, okay? Those who suffer from a grave defect of discretion of judgment concerning the essential matrimonial rights and duties mutually to be handed over and accepted. Okay. There can be lots of different reasons why someone's not capable. Let's say someone, let's see our wonderful couple again.
Sure.
Wedding day, both free to marry, all good. Steve gets nervous, so he gets drunk out of his mind right before the wedding ceremony. Is he capable of giving consent at the wedding? No. He's not. His critical faculty, if you're not good enough to drive a car, you're probably not good enough to give your life entirely to someone else for the rest of your life, okay?
So is this, where people get in trouble if they come in and they're suffering from an addiction, an abuse, alcohol, or something of that sort? Yeah,
so when someone's like drunk at the wedding or high at the wedding, okay, that would be like an actual impediment to the use of reason, use of discretion of judgment, okay? But addiction is not actual always, but habitual. So maybe they're having a good day, but they just really, in general, are not the kind of person who are able to make coherent choices, life decisions, things like that. They might say something one day and be completely onto something else the next. You know, they said, "Oh, I married you?" Yeah, I mean that's not a good sign.
What if the spouse or one spouse gets to the wedding and discovers that the other one is drunk, but they go through it anyway?
Yeah, I mean, most priests, if they know for sure, they would call it off. I think most priests would. You know, if you have a drink, I don't know. Everyone's different. I think you could probably get away with a drink. I don't recommend it. Most priests would say don't do it. Okay, but yeah. But no, if it was such that they couldn't really even bring forth an act of consent, and I've seen it's come up in cases, and usually the best person to ask is the groomsman. Okay, hey, what were you guys doing before the wedding? And they'll say, "Oh yeah, he got blitzed." Okay, and they're like, "Oh yeah, he had his first shot." Okay, well, so it's not the best time to have that. Okay, oh boy, do we have a story?
Just in case in point, there was a wedding here this is maybe a couple of years ago, and I walked in to where the groomsmen were, and they were, knocking them down.
Wow.
And I cautioned them. I said, "You guys better stop now, otherwise I'm not going to be able to." I actually had to tell them that.
Yeah.
Because they had 4 or 5 cases in there. And, I mean, they were, well, maybe not 4 or 5, but 3 anyway. And I said, you got to stop right now. And I actually pulled the groomsmen aside and talked to them, trying to evaluate whether at that point, so to your point, I mean, it happened right down here.
Sure, yeah, and you can make an evaluation. I mean, it's, So again, it could be something actual like that, but it could be habitual. Like addiction makes someone habitually lacking in the ability to make discretion, make good judgments and choices. the kind that you need about, and this in particular is about the rights and duties to be handed over and accepted. Okay, so do you have the judgment necessary for marriage in particular? Okay, because even children have a kind of discretionary judgment. If they don't have the kind of discretionary judgment, you need to get married. Okay, so it's an extra step. And then the third kind of note here, which is similar to the second, they're incapable, who are not able to assume the essential obligations of marriage for causes of a psychic nature. Okay, so essential obligations of marriage, again, being open to children and raising those children, being faithful, okay, and remaining together forever. Okay, if you have some kind of psychic issue that makes it impossible for you to raise children, okay? Makes it impossible for you to do the sorts of things necessary to have children. Maybe you have an irrational fear of men. So he touches you and you get all scared. It's like, well, that's not going to work for marriage, okay? You have a phobia that makes that not possible, okay? Addiction can be a big piece. People who are, who chronically act out, addictions, sexual addictions. So they're not, and so on some level, not capable of being faithful. Okay, obviously there's room for healing and things like that. But if it's at such a level that you would say it's psychic in nature, like if there's a psychological issue, how can you consent to something you're not capable of doing? Okay, and so the church asks, nature seems to require at least the capacity. Okay, now someone might be weak and say, I'm going to try to be faithful, but I'm just not perfect, and there are a lot of pretty women out there. Okay, well, maybe we'll wait on marriage for just a little bit till you're a little more mature. Okay, but even if you go through with it, as long as you're capable, okay, that's what's necessary to be able to give that consent. Okay, other kind of involuntary defects would be force and fear. Okay. Oftentimes, we'll ask, was there a pregnancy that happened before the marriage? Okay. And sometimes people say, I would not have married this person if it wasn't because of the pregnancy. Okay. If it weren't for the fact that this person got pregnant, I wouldn't have married her. Okay. If that was the motivating cause, it seems like there was a fear that was the ultimate cause of marriage. And so that can be something, it's relevant. Again, there's more questions we have to ask if that's involved. If you look at the wedding pictures and notice, hey, her dad in the front row's got a shotgun there. Okay? It's possible that force or fear was a motivator here. Okay?
You forget the shotgun.
Yeah.
But let's say the parents are super Catholic.
Yeah.
All right, from way back. And the two eloped.
Yeah.
All right. And one's Catholic, one's not. But
Yeah.
the parents you are getting this blessed in the church.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
That's another.
Yeah. So there's the fear. So the fear that's most obvious is a fear of physical harm. So the shotgun is the clearest example. But yeah, there could be fear of grave loss of other sorts. So you feel like, oh, my parent, especially someone who their parents are their whole life, or like that's their only relationship, only people they know. And if I don't do this, they're going to cut me out of their life forever. Okay, that's a sufficiently grave cause of fear that it really does remove the freedom that's necessary to make an act of consent. So yeah, and again, you can gauge that because there are different levels. Sometimes you're like, even the pregnancy case, some men are just like, I'm just going to do the right thing and marry her. Okay, and it's not like they don't feel forced. They just feel, oh no, that's the right thing to do. Okay, that's still a free action. Okay, so it still can be a free action in those circumstances. Someone might say, oh, my parents are going to be happy if I get married. Okay, it's okay to have that thought. Okay, for that to be in the mix. But if it's the sole motivator, or even the primary motivator, such that you wouldn't do it without it. Okay, that's kind of the clincher there. That's when that's really significant. Okay. And again, is it clear that this is much harder to figure out and reconstruct? Okay. Again, in general, the church presumes that the marriage is valid. Okay, he said yes, she said yes, we have witnesses, we're going to roll with it. Okay. But if there's a doubt, well, we have to ask a lot of questions to uncover that doubt. Okay. Where are we at? Okay. Am I doing? Are you guys still okay? Are you going? Or I don't want to
We gotta go pray.
Oh, you have to go pray? Oh, good. We can pray for us. I didn't get to receive. I'll do real. So this is the substantive. Okay, this is just real quick. Sorry. This is the substantive law. Okay, we look at what is marriage, how can marriage be defective? So these are the sorts of things a canon lawyer needs to know how to look for, okay? The next thing, I'm going to erase this, I'll erase this, is the actual process, okay? How do you go about it? The simplest answer is just go talk to father, okay? I mean, if someone has any doubt about their marriage, usually it's after they've been already civilly divorced. Don't just think, oh, Steve's getting on my nerves today. I'm gonna go talk to father, see what we can do. Okay, don't do that. It's after a marriage relationship has been kind of irreparably, it's really beyond repair, okay? And usually it's connected to the question of, am I free to marry? Okay? This person walked out of my life, okay? We're not getting back together no matter what, okay? It would be nice to be married, okay? Can I get married? That's usually the question, okay? And there at least has to be some doubt that something was wrong with the initial marriage, okay? So like I said, you'll talk to father, tell him your situation, and he'll work through you with the next step, okay? I'll just do real quick kind of what the process looks like, okay? The first thing is a petition. The only person who can challenge a marriage is one of the two spouses, okay? So, you know, maybe, I don't know, maybe Kim over here is watching this couple, and she's like, I don't think they were really married. She just suspects, he probably tricked her into it, and there's just no way. How did he get her, you know? Okay. However many doubts Kim has, she cannot start an annulment process. Only one of these two can, okay? There might be some cases of notoriously public marriages, and we have a certain office called the promoter of justice, who also could initiate a marriage cause for the sake of the public good. That would be like royalty or something. I'm the promoter of justice. I've never had to do that. I probably never will, okay? It's the two parties, okay? Their kids can't start the process. Their parents can't start the process. Only one of them, okay? That petition usually takes the form of an application, okay? Put their names, the dates when you got married, all the facts, statistics, okay? The next piece is the judge receives it in the tribunal, okay? They set the ground, okay? Whenever you have a trial, you have to know, let's say you have a criminal trial, you have to know what you're being accused of, right? Okay? And the judge has to know what the accusation is so he can make a judgment. So in a marriage case, it's not him versus her, okay? You know, you're the one who broke the marriage, you're the one who made it null. Nope. We don't care who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's bad, okay? It's not a criminal trial, okay? What's being accused is the marriage, okay? You, marriage, I think are null for this reason, for that reason, okay? So setting the ground is figuring out which one of these reasons do we think the marriage was null for, okay? Again, if it's this, it can be a quick process, you can skip half of this, okay? But if it's anything here, okay, you know, he said yes, but he never broke up with the girlfriend he had before we got married, okay? He kept seeing her all the time. Okay, so the ground is gonna be defect, exclusion of fidelity on the part of the respondent is how we would phrase that, okay? Again, talk to the priest, talk to the tribunal, we'll help you set the ground, okay? Because we know people don't know the technical language, what canon to cite, okay? But that's part of it, is setting the grounds. Sometimes grounds will be set, and then as evidence comes to light, we're like, oh, this ground is way more obvious than that ground, okay? And so then we can add the ground or change the ground if it's helpful, okay? But setting the ground is kind of the good foundation for the whole trial, okay? Citation of parties, okay? This is the part that people, most of the time when someone wants an annulment, the other party doesn't care, okay? The other person's moved on with their life, maybe they're already civilly remarried, they left the church, whatever, they don't care, okay? Still, it's their marriage though, okay? So they do receive a citation, okay? A letter is sent to them in the mail saying, your former spouse wants an annulment. Because this was your marriage, you have a right to participate, okay? Most common response is people ignore the letter, or they write back saying, never contact me again, or they say, I don't really care, I wish them a good life, you know. In general, most of the time the response is pretty hands-off, okay? The ideal response usually is, yeah, sure, how can I help? Like, what do you need? What do you need from me? Okay. a response that can be more difficult is when the other spouse is opposed to it, okay? There can be different reasons for that, but the other spouse might say, well, no, I think that was a real marriage. I meant what I said, and I think they meant what they said. They have the right to defend the marriage, to defend whatever side they want, okay? But the citation is they have to be involved. This doesn't mean necessarily that they'll see all the evidence, okay? They'll have an advocate appointed for them, kind of like a lawyer, and that lawyer will be allowed to look through all the evidence and make arguments on their behalf, okay? But they have to be at least invited to participate, okay? Sometimes people, their spouse left them, and they have no idea where they are, okay? We have to at least make a good faith effort to contact them, okay? But if it's really impossible to find them, we can still move forward, okay? But we have to at least make an effort to contact the person, okay? As a matter of justice.
You also have cases where it could actually cause that person harm if that other person is contacted as well. So, I mean, there's some...
Yeah, so we're always very careful that it's, again, the right of defense. We're talking about that line between positive law and natural law. The right of defense belongs to natural law, okay? So if we're, making an accusation of this marriage that involves this other person, they have a right to know about it, okay? But yeah, we'll do what we can to make sure all rights are preserved. And so if we think the person, maybe there's evidence that would be
physical abuse. Prejudicial,
yeah. If there's a history of physical abuse, we'll be very careful about who can look at the evidence, who can refer to it, cite it. But they do have to be at least cited. There has to be. It's a very bare minimum. But they have. I've seen. This was not our diocese. I've seen another case outside the diocese where a wife wanted the annulment. She got divorced. She wanted the annulment. She said, "Oh, he's abusive. I don't want him involved at all." Okay, so they said, "Okay, we just won't contact him." Okay. Well, maybe a year later, that guy finds out she got married in the church, and he says, "Oh, that's not possible. There's no annulment, because I would have found out about it if there was." Okay, well, there was an annulment, and he wasn't involved at all. So what does he do? He writes to his bishop, okay? The bishop kind of blows him off, so eventually he writes to the Vatican, and the Vatican overturns the decision because they said his right of defense, he might be a really bad guy, but he has rights, okay? And he was denied the right to defend himself, okay, by not being cited, okay? Again, there are a lot of ways to protect people's rights, but those most basic rights do have to be preserved.
What about the misnomer that this will make my children illegitimate?
Oh yeah, it's so strange to me that this is so common. A lot of people are afraid to get annulment because they're afraid it will make their children illegitimate, okay? It won't. I don't have the canon ready, but there's an explicit canon that says children of a putative marriage are considered legitimate, okay? So a putative marriage is a marriage that was at any point in time considered to be valid, okay? So they're legitimate regardless, even after marriage is declared null. So that's the first thing, okay? That won't change the status of your children. Second of all, legitimacy doesn't have any effects in canon law. I think maybe 200 years ago, if you were illegitimate, you weren't allowed to become a cardinal, okay? But the Pope himself could dispense from that. And since he's the one who picks the cardinals anyway, it kind of didn't matter, okay? And since the church doesn't do much with inheritance law or any of that stuff, it's really a non-issue. And so,
in divorce, I mean, and you've got people that are uninformed. You got divorced, you can't receive communion.
Oh, sure.
Okay. The only way that comes into effect is if you are married again, or
exactly,
in a simple relationship.
Yeah, no, the very simple act of being civilly divorced, okay? Again, in general, I wouldn't recommend it, obviously, except in the most extreme situations, especially to defend the rights of children. That's the place where the church would at least permit it for that separation. It can be permitted, and certainly it's not an obstacle to receiving Holy Communion. But if you're living with another person in the manner of married persons, but you're not married to them, that's where sin comes in, okay?
We've got a lot of follow-away Catholics.
Sure.
Okay, that have gotten civilly divorced, that have been told by a family member, an uncle, maybe even a few misinformed priests, okay, that you can't receive communion.
Sure. No, I talked to I'm a pastor now, 2 parishes, and someone came up. They wanted to meet with me, and they said, "Father, I got divorced years ago. He left me, and so he got divorced, and I I haven't been receiving communion for, maybe 10 years. And I said, well, who are you living with that, and she's like, oh, I'm never living with a man ever again. And I said, oh, well, then you're fine. So, I mean, there might be healing and stuff that needs to happen there. There might be some forgiveness. Probably going to go to confession anyway. But it's the habitual sin of living with someone you're not married to that keeps one from being able to approach communion. Okay, the very fact of being divorced doesn't do that. Okay, so yeah,
And the paperwork can be intimidating.
oh sure,
Okay? And
yeah,
it can be looked at and say, well, I can't, I don't want to go into any of that, right? But the healing process for that individual who goes through that paperwork is tremendous.
yeah. I'm trying to. I think I can get through the rest of this. It'll include some of that, yeah. So, but yeah. So once the parties are cited, okay, that's what opens the case, okay. And during the next part is just the collecting of evidence, okay. It's not like a murder case where you have blood samples and all that. Okay, most of it's just testimony, a lot of it, okay? So the different kinds of evidence we have are documents, okay? We want marriage certificates, baptismal certificates, anything like that, that's easy. Deposition of the parties, okay? And this is the part that is the most intimidating. If you sit down with Father Pinto and want to get through the annulment, you're gonna eventually see an about eight page questionnaire. Oh, is it 125? I haven't counted them. 125 really personal questions about that most difficult moment in your entire life. Okay? Why? Because we're usually trying to figure out what your active consent was. Okay? So we're picking that apart. Okay? That's the hard, painful part. Because you have to go kind of remember that entire experience. Okay? Once you've done this, that's the hardest part, okay? Both parties are invited to do that. Usually it's just the party who wants the annulment who's actually going to do it. But both parties have a chance to kind of give their whole side of the story, okay? I don't know if you just make them take it home and fill it out?
Yeah.
I know some priests who will sit down and meet with someone week after week to type it all up.
I let them take it home.
Yeah.
And then we have a meeting, we come back and go through it.
Yeah.
And I always, it's easier now because we do it, I really try to urge them to do it on a, word perfect or something, then we just go in and.
Yeah, no, just like a Word doc. Please type if you're doing this. I've seen handwritten pages. I don't want to see handwritten pages. Type it up, But then go over, usually with your priest. Your priest is usually your advocate, so he's going to help you through the process, okay? You get witnesses. We usually request 6 witnesses, and we don't just want your parents who love you and think the other person was in the wrong, okay? The best are people, like your friends or siblings maybe, who knew you well at the time you got married, okay? We're really interested in that moment of consent, okay? So witnesses to that, like again, if someone excluded fidelity, okay? I want people who you talked about that with, okay? People who knew about it from the outside. It's great to hear the story from a completely different perspective from someone who saw it, okay? Even as horrible as it is, it really helps, okay? And we always want to have at least 2 witnesses, which is why we always ask for 6, okay? And you just tell them, and then we usually send them a questionnaire. We can have people come in and just talk to us in person, but it's usually easier for them to write it out, okay? Expert report. So let's say they do have some kind of psychological issue. I'm not a psychologist, okay? So I might say that guy's really attached to gambling, okay? Is he addicted? I can't make that judgment, okay? So we would bring in an expert who could make that this person had clinical addiction to gambling, to sex, to this kind of drug, that kind of drug, okay? Alcohol, okay? They had, ADHD. Well, does ADHD mean you can't get married? I would guess there are probably some cases where it rises to such a level that it's possible, okay? I would guess that there are cases where it doesn't rise to that level, okay? I would need an expert to help me make that decision, okay? To say, was this person capable of giving consent, fulfilling the obligations of marriage, things like that. So it's an expert report. These are the main ones. There might be other ones that can come up, but those are the main sorts of evidence, okay? So we gather all those, Then we get to the briefs, okay, from the advocates, okay. You have the person who petitions, their advocate can write a brief. You have the person who, the other party, so like, the man and the woman, okay? Each of them can look at the evidence, or their advocate can look at the evidence, write up an argument for their side. We have an additional person called the defender of the bond, okay? The church is interested in the sanctity of marriage, so we have someone whose job it is to defend marriage, okay? So they'll be arguing on behalf of the marriage, okay? And that's been required since I should know this, 1771 or something. 51? I don't know. It was Pope Benedict XIV, okay, who required it, okay? And it's someone who just argues in favor of marriage. Then the judge makes his decision, okay? The judge has to read, he has to be familiar with all the evidence, read all the briefs from all the parties, including the defender of the bond, and then he makes his decision. He writes a definitive sentence that gives all the facts that he's basing his decision on, gives an explanation of the relevant laws, and then finally his argumentation that puts that all together, okay? And he has two possibilities. Affirmative, the marriage in question is null on this ground, and therefore usually this person is free to marry, okay? Or negative. Even with all of this evidence, we have not been able to overturn our conviction that this marriage was a valid marriage. They are not free to remarry, okay? Those are the two outcomes, okay? It's possible someone doesn't like their outcome, okay? One way or the other, okay? It's not the end of the line. This doesn't happen too often, but then you have appeal, okay? Someone was asking earlier, didn't Pope Francis make it easier to get annulments? And the answer is yes, he did, just a little bit. Before 2015, every time there was an affirmative decision, the defender of the bond was required to appeal, okay? He had to appeal every case, okay? Pope Francis got rid of the mandatory appeal, so the defender of the bond can still appeal if he thinks a case should be negative, but if he doesn't have a real good reason for thinking that, it's not required, okay? And where would appeal go? From Kalamazoo, it usually goes to Detroit, and if Detroit's decision gets appealed, it can go to Rome, okay? Judged by the Roman Rota there, okay? There can also be a different kind of appeal where you have trouble with the procedural issues. So like, let's say you have the other party, I never got cited. I didn't get a chance to defend my rights, okay? Well, that's a procedural defect, which will get judged in a slightly different way, but that would overturn the decision. Basically, it would annul the decision itself. And then usually, because then there's no faith in the judge, the case would get transferred to a different diocese, okay? That's pretty rare, but I've studied that in particular because I find it interesting. So,
Who is the judge that makes the final decision?
yeah, so we have a panel of judges in the diocese. I am one of them. They're appointed by the bishop, someone who has a degree in canon law. So I studied for 3 years in addition to my normal priestly studies to get my license in canon law. In our diocese, it would be me, Father Jeff Hanley is one. He's the pastor in Hastings. Father Ken Schmidt, he's like in charge of the tribunal, but he's also one of our judges. He's in Kalamazoo. Monsignor Martin, he's the pastor down south of Kalamazoo, where St. Martin's, I forget, down in Vicksburg. He's a judge. And then Father Deacon Hal Bowen, okay? And so the requirement to judge, to be like a sole judge, the church wants to have a panel of judges in every case, if possible, so like 3 judges that vote. In smaller dioceses, usually you just get 1 judge, okay? And that judge has to be a cleric with a decent reputation, so a deacon is like the minimum. And they have to have a canon law degree, okay? So we all have that.
Are you seeing an increase or decrease in annulment requests?
I would say, I don't know, so we're not the only, so this is Kim, by the way, just so you guys know. She basically runs the tribunal, okay? So she's the one processing all the paperwork. It all comes through her. So yeah, you would probably see how many more we've had or less.
We've had more than last year, so it's not as much as I guess quite a few years ago, but they're picking up. It seems like.
So 2015, right after Pope Francis changed the law to make it a little easier, there was a huge influx. Just because it was on the news, people are thinking about it, people heard it's easier, so people are giving it a shot, Okay, so there was a big influx then, but I think because so many kind of happened at that time, it then kind of trailed off for a while after that. But it's been kind of erratic, just like kind of people entering the church. That oftentimes people who enter the church, that's the reason why people get interested in doing it, because they've got a past, so we want to sort through that. So, yeah.
I have two questions. One, does this cost anything for the
Oh, yeah.
petitioner? Like to pay themselves to go through this process, or what is that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I used to know the figure for how much it costed, like as far as personnel, materials, and all that sort of stuff. The individual applying, it doesn't cost them anything. That was something else Pope Francis insisted that there be no fees for the people involved, and I think that's important. Obviously, things still cost money. Okay, so like if you wanted to give a contribution, that would be generous. But no, you won't get a check, you won't get a bill, you won't even get an envelope. Okay, so 2015. Some dioceses already did it gratuitously. Okay, but it became a universal rule 2015.
There were dioceses that charged for that.
Sure. Yeah.
The Archdiocese of Detroit.
Yeah, and it's not contrary to justice. I mean, again, it's people working. It makes sense you pay people who work. Okay. Yeah, but now the bishop's annual appeal covers that entirely.
So
So
that's where you get the remember us and the bishop's appeal.
yeah, oh definitely. Oh sure. Yeah. So no, it does not cost. You won't see anything. So okay. We're basically Q&A, so I actually not yeah. So go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry, just
Yeah.
one more question. This might be dumb and obvious, but if I'm the petitioner and I would like my marriage annulled, and I go through that process, and so does my former husband, like he's annulled, like he also, like he's free to marry.
Sure.
despite
The
that I
marriage
went through-
itself, again, is either valid or invalid. Okay.
Okay,
So if that marriage is declared invalid, you are both free to marry, at least with respect to that. It's possible. Let's say the decision though was based on some kind of incapacity. Okay. Like let's say your former spouse, they're like, oh no, he has the mental capacity of an 8-year-old. Okay. The church might then declare the marriage null, but then say this guy shouldn't get married. It seems like he's lacking. Okay. So then someone would be informed of that. So if he attempted to get married in the church, they would pull that out and look at that. Okay. But otherwise, one would be free to marry. Sometimes there are two things we call a vetitum and a monitum. These are Latin words. Okay. Vetitum and monitum. A vetitum means this person is not allowed to get married, usually until they do something else. Okay? Let's say the marriage was declared null because someone excluded fidelity. Okay? Well, they're not allowed to get married in the church until it's been made clear that they understand fidelity, usually. Usually they have to do some kind of counseling, meet with their pastor, but there would be some kind of something, again, put on that person that says you can't get married until you do this. Okay? A monitum, that's Latin for warning. Okay? So and this is much more common, I'd say. There's something that was defective between these people. They seem like they're relatively normal people, and so they can get married, but they should address this, okay, before they get married, okay? It would still be valid. They're still allowed to get married, but they should address this. But a monitum doesn't, there's no action item that's required to get married. So, but those are the two kind of things that can be tacked on to an affirmative decision. Okay. And that would be like one case, where one is free to marry, the other's not. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
So not to open a can of worms, but
Sure. It's just one big can of worms. It's worms all the way down. So don't be afraid. Yeah.
given the way society's going, does canon law define a man and a woman?
No, it's just refer to nature. Yeah. The capacity to bring forth offspring, I mean, that is always what we're looking for, kind of. So someone can call themselves, oh, Father, a few years back I decided to buy Mrs. instead of Mr. I hope you don't mind. It's like, well, okay, but that's not what we're looking at, okay? We're looking at generative capacity, okay? The church has always understood, people say gender a lot nowadays. This is too dramatic. We don't care about that. We care about sex, okay? The capacity for the actions that can lead to having offspring, okay? That's most relevant.
That makes sense.
Now, if there's a difference, a dysphoria, okay, there's this sexual characteristic, but this psychological identity, that might cause a problem for getting married, okay? But you'd have to look at each of those individually, because you're right, society changes too quick to make a general rule for some of those things. Okay, but the basics always stay the same.
So let's say you have somebody that had some sort of medical thing, they had to get a hysterectomy, or there was some sort of accident, a war or something. Then what?
And I'm looking at our age group here to see what I'm allowed to talk about. The bare minimum required by the church is the capacity to consummate the marriage. Okay, so again, to do the act that would lead to having offspring. Okay, this involves, again, I'm not going to get too specific, some kind of carnal union, though, of the genitals. Okay, there, that's as specific as I'm going to get. Okay, so someone who's had a hysterectomy is still capable of that, if I'm not mistaken. Are they going to have a child? No, barring a miracle, it's not going to happen. Okay, a woman who's 60 years old, in most cases, is she going to have a child through being united to a man? No. Okay, but is she still capable of the act that would lead to having children? If the answer is yes, then she's capable of marriage. Okay, you might wonder, why are they getting married that old? Don't think too hard about it. Okay, and the classic example is like John the Baptist's parents. Okay, Elizabeth and Zechariah. Elizabeth was well past childbearing age. Okay, did she end up having a child? Yes. Okay, so the Lord can do it. Okay, but again, there's just the very basic capacity for the one human being to enter the other human being is what's required. Okay, so again, I get much more physical, but that's it. It's the bare minimum. So yeah. So there's yeah.
What percent of your work as a judge is involved in annulment versus other?
All of it. No, not all of it. So as a canon lawyer, I mean, there are other things I do. As judge, yeah, it's pretty much exclusively marriage related. So like people ask, well, what else would you judge? And I would say it'd be worse. Criminal cases, for example. And thanks be to God, I'm not involved in any cases that involve misconduct or things like that. That would be a case where it involves judges, evidence, and things.
So as a canon lawyer, you might look at other things.
Yeah, that's right. And as a judge, I'm basically just appointed as a marriage judge. Okay, I would need to be like appointed specially to judge like a criminal case. Let's say there was a dispute between two parishes over a piece of property. Okay, that we could make that kind of decision without getting the government involved with ecclesiastical courts. I have not seen that happen in our diocese, but in bigger dioceses, older dioceses, that sort of thing can come up as well. Okay, but the majority of my work as a judge is marriage.
So people that want an annulment, it does not have to go through Rome, it's done at the diocese level.
Yep.
Is it always been?
That's a good question. I don't know always, because again, the church has a really big history. But in general, yeah, it would always at least start there. The bishop, there's a line in the code. The bishop is the natural judge of his flock. Okay, so every diocese, the bishop has kind of always been understood as the one who could make those judgments. That's his prerogative, and the tribunal, the judges, help him carry out that office. Okay, but then yeah, the right to appeal is something so fundamental in legal justice that then we rely on the fact that the church is bigger than the diocese to be able to appeal to Detroit or to appeal to Rome. Because what is it? Another line from the code: the first see is judged by no one. Okay. I love this. You guys, has anyone here read the Acts of the Apostles? Okay, a lot of people have. Yeah, good book. The first 2/3 is way more interesting than the last third, in my opinion. Okay, the first 2/3, you have like people getting stoned to death. You got miracles. You got conversion of Paul. Great stuff. Okay, I love it. The last third of the book is St. Paul being accused of a crime and him saying, "I appeal to Rome." And so guess what? He's a Roman citizen. They're going to cart him all over the place until he finally arrives at Rome. It's just St. Paul going through the Roman legal system. It's kind of boring, but as a lawyer, it's kind of interesting. And so the fact that St. Paul did that in a civil, in the civil realm, is reflected by the church. The fact that we still appeal to Rome. That's the last word on the case. So yeah. So again, you try to solve things more locally if you can, but Rome is always the final word. So yeah. Yeah, in most cases, do not go to Rome. I'd say 1 in 50, 100, 1 in 100, yeah. It's very rare, okay, so.
You mentioned the Acts of the Council of Nicaea. Do you actually have that on your bookshelf?
I have it on my bookshelf. I don't think every priest does, but I do. Yeah, I've got a great little volume that has the first 4 councils with all of its canons and a bunch of commentary on it. I love it. Yeah, so. Good. Yeah.
Getting back to the voluntary,
Sure.
you're talking about fidelity, like when they're getting married and stuff, but when that changes down the road, does it still have the same?
Good question. Yeah. Whenever we're looking at marriage, we are looking at that moment they got married, okay? Consent is what makes the marriage, so we're looking at what happened at the time of consent. Were you a qualified person at the time of consent, okay? Was it legitimately manifested at the time of consent, okay? Did you have your capacity, and did you do so voluntarily at the time of consent? Did you intend to be faithful at the time, okay? So yeah, maybe 2 years into the marriage. Well, usually it's not 2 years. Let's say 10 years. 10 years, 20 years into the marriage. Yeah, he gets tired, he starts seeing other women, okay? That's a moral failure, okay? That's a sin, okay? That does not change what you said when you got married, okay? So, and that's what we're looking at, okay? That's why I'm always be clear again, we're not saying who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's bad. We're saying what happened when you got married, okay? So yeah, so something down the line.
Could be a case where it would be a negative.
Could be. And again, the behavior, we'll look at maybe within a year of after someone got married, because that can be telling. Okay, they said this, but like a week later, he was already on dating again. That's weird, okay? So that, again, that's evidence of what he actually consented to. But if there's nothing, I've seen a case where I was helping the guy as an advocate, okay? He's like, oh, yeah, she was the perfect wife. I was the perfect husband. 20 years, we had perfect children. We were the perfect parents. We were perfect. And then I made a mistake one day, and now we don't live together. And I'm like, well, it sounds like a broken marriage, but it sounds like a marriage, okay? There was, someone made mistakes, but they didn't make them in a place that would make the marriage itself invalid, okay? So, yeah, so it's a good question. This is what we ask a lot of questions about a lot of the person's life, but it's to tell us about that moment. That's the essential moment. Yeah. Oh yeah. So yeah, if you have any more questions, feel free to come up to me and just ask. I definitely, I don't know what my time limit was, but I probably have gone over it. Again, I tried to tell you everything I know, and surprise, surprise, there's still more. We have handouts here though these are kind of just basic guides that we give to people. They explain what the different grounds are, the process that you go through, and they have a Q&A. And so if you know someone who it might be helpful for, go ahead and grab 2. They don't mind. Again, a lot of this was just not so, again, Kim and Steve were joking about what their options are. Okay, but in general, it's good for Catholics to be more informed about these things, because a lot of people, it is just hearsay. People think, oh, my kids are going to be bastards. It's like, well, no, that's not what this is about, okay? So the more people have at least a basic understanding of this, the more you can help people who need answers on this sort of thing, okay? Yeah. Ultimately, the church, there's one last quote from the code. The very last canon, Canon 1752, says, Lex suprema salus animarum. The supreme law of the church is the salvation of souls, okay? We don't do this because we just like digging up your past and kind of making you have to relive all those horrible moments. We do this because we care about the salvation of souls, okay? If we can help you be married to the person you're living with and save your soul at the same time, that's our goal, okay? And so, again, just being informed of this can hopefully help you be better as an evangelizer, as a witness to Christ, as a witness to the reality of marriage, and the role of the church with respect to marriage.
Very good.
Thank you.
They don't care. I mean,